Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Whale Nerds podcast. My name is Katlyn. This is episode 148. And this episode, I want to talk to you about my summer season in the Arctic in Svalbard. But before we get into it, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who supports the podcast in whatever way, shape, or form you do. If it's just listening to episodes, if it's sharing it with a friend, rating or reviewing the podcast on whatever platform you listen to. And especially thank you to those that support us on Patreon. Your monthly contributions help keep the podcast going. It's not free to produce a podcast. And so this is always much, much appreciated from all of you on Patreon. This year has been a lot less episodes than we typically put out. Some of you know my guiding schedule has been pretty rigorous, and also just trying to stay in a routine and figure out how to deliver the podcast when I'm not in country or at home very often has been tricky. But I definitely wanted to get on here and share the Svalbard season with you all, and thank you for sticking with us, even though the podcast schedule is not what it was in the just a few years ago. And if you want to keep track of what's going on with the podcast, we do have social media. We have Facebook, Instagram. We put our video versions of the episodes up on YouTube. And then also we have a website, thewhalenerds.com. You can check out the blog. You can check out the merch. You can get the Spotify version of the podcast on there. And so we always appreciate you checking those things out and following along with us. So this summer, I was guiding on a ship for Oceanwide, the Hondius, in Svalbard for 2 months. And it was a very different season than I've ever done before. First of all, guiding that far north in the Arctic. I mean, Svalbard's like 78 degrees north. It's really, really up there. But also my first time guiding around polar bears. So in Alaska, when I was guiding, we did have bear protection things with us when we were out guiding around black bears and brown bears, but that's things like bear spray and like noise making deterrents and things like that. And with polar bears, that you can't do that. So you have to have a firearm with you. You have a flare gun and a firearm as your deterrents when you're in polar bear country. And the firearm's like a big hunting rifle. And so I had to get trained on how to use a firearm and then shoot with my own like ship issued weapon when I got to the ship, when I got to port. And then carry it with me anytime we were off the ship, basically, every time we were on land. And then in the Zodiacs, a lot of the pairs have to carry at least one pair of the two Zodiacs that go cruising together have to carry a firearm on the boat in a Pelican case. So that was very different than anything else I've ever done. I I told the people that hired me from Oceanwide when I did my interview before the last Antarctic season, they just kind of casually asked about the Arctic and, like, what do I have any firearms training, anything like that? And I was like, I know I'm American, but I've never touched a gun. So it was, yeah, it was an interesting experience. And I don't love it because it's a lot of responsibility and it's kind of scary, but it is what you have to do to be working around polar bears. And it's not that like in an emergency, I think I could shoot the bear if I had to, but what is scary to me is just having a firearm around other people. Like that's the part that hangs me up. Which I mean I think is better than being like very casual about it. Like you're carrying a half-loaded weapon around guests. Like you have to really, it's a whole nother level of awareness that you have to keep track of when you're in the field compared to like going down to Antarctica or anything. So I'm very happy to be going back to Antarctica and not have to do the firearms protocol because leopard seals are like the scariest thing down there, and we don't carry firearms for them. We just drive away. So I worked on the ship for about 2 months, and it was towards the beginning of the season. And so the first trip of our season in Svalbard was actually to go to the north, specifically looking for bowhead whales. And so it was kind of catered to be more of like a whale and polar bear trip. Um, and we had guests on board that had some really high expectations, especially for seeing bowhead whales. And there's only a few hundred bowhead whales between the east of Greenland and Svalbard, like, period. Like, hundreds of kilometers of water, and there's only a few hundred bowhead whales there, period. So it was really hard to manage expectations, I think, because I'm not sure that everyone understood the plan, but also like what we're up against for finding these whales. There have been really, really successful trips with Oceanwide in the past, to the point where they have actually published data from those trips because they had such big sightings of bowhead whales. And they had researchers on board who were opportunistically sampling for them. And so when you see one-off trips like that, it can really give you a false impression that like you're guaranteed to see a bowhead whale from a trip in Svalbard. I think the trips in Greenland have better success from what I've heard from other guides, but we did pull it off, which was incredible. We spent more than 1 day in the sea ice. But for me, as the only marine mammal person on board, I had my work cut out for me because I was in a new place, looking for new species that I've never seen before. And like, yes, I do have a lot of marine mammal training. I did a lot of research on the ship. I did feel like I was treading water a little bit at the beginning of the season, trying to get my brain around like, oh, this is the first trip and I'm on here by myself, and like we're gonna find bowhead whales, I guess. um, but I did figure it out. I read some research papers while on board, trying to look for like the best habitat areas to aim for, and trying to figure out like where have the historic sightings been that are like within the range of the ship. Because like the other thing about the historic sightings from Oceanwide that was published is that was like a cross ocean trip going from like Jan Mayen to Svalbard. And so they were covering water much further west than like we had any possibility of getting to on our trip. So we couldn't just like go to that place and be like, this is the bowhead whale hotspot. We had to like really think about what we could reach in the time that we had, and what was our best option for finding them. The first sighting was really fairly brief, and the whales were like, it was one whale and it was surface feeding, but like circling in between like fairly dense ice. Like the ship couldn't just easily turn around and find it and stick with it. And every once in a while it would like disappear for like 10 to 15 minutes. And we were like, and it could have been that just surfaced like really covertly behind a piece of ice. And like we missed the surfacing, but it also could have been that it was just like holding its breath. Um, so the first sighting was kind of like a brief one-off thing, and then the second sighting was 2 days later. We went back up into the sea ice and we spent all day searching, and I did my best to like show the navigation team on the bridge like we really want like open or very open drift ice, because we get a sea ice chart from the Norwegian government every few days of like how thick the ice is and where it is. And I was like, but we also want to be like over a shelf, and like this is the areas where there have been historic sightings in the last like 20 years. And so we just like rolled the dice and tried our best to get to an area that seemed right, you know. And I kept coming up and like looking at the watercolor and being like, there's no plankton here, like I don't think they're gonna be here. um and then we came across, I think the staff was out taking a group photo actually. And like someone came up to the bridge and like told the bridge they saw something, and then they radioed us and we were like, is this a joke? Because we're out taking like the team photo for 5 minutes. Like this is the one time the whole trip that all the team is unavailable. But no, they really did find it. And when we got closer and like finally kind of got honed in on where the animal was, it actually turned out to be two. It was a mom and a calf pair, and the mom was surface feeding. But unfortunately, the sighting, like, we did our best to like gently and calmly and quietly approach, and we did get some fairly good looks from a distance. But when we tried to close the distance down a little bit, the mom took the calf and just ran into thicker ice so that we couldn't get to them, which is unfortunate for us, for our sighting, but is the behavior that saved them during whaling, right? So bowhead whales were heavily decimated in the early days of whaling in the Arctic and the North Atlantic because they're such a rotund and buoyant whale, and relatively slow. And so they were easy to catch for the whaling vessels. And there's hundreds of years of exploitation history in Svalbard. Svalbard has been drastically changed by humans, in general with the marine mammal populations, but also now in modern times by the rate that the environment's changing due to climate change. But anyways, back to the bowhead whales. So their behavior to escape a threat is to swim into thick ice. And they do have the ability to break through ice that's 60 centimeters thick. And so they could get away from almost everything. Killer whales, ships that don't have ice breaking capability. So their behavior, the ones that survived, had that strong behavior response to run away from whatever was perceived a threat. And bowhead whales have been hunted like fairly recently, and they live a long time. So like it's totally plausible that some of the bowhead whales we saw this season were alive during when whaling was still happening on bowhead whales in the Arctic. But also these are probably only the first generation of whales born to whales that remember hunting as well. So like that cultural knowledge of bowhead whales is very, very strong. And I was not surprised at all to see that response where the mom was like, nope, we're not doing this. And she went into the ice. But it was really cool to see, even if it was from a distance. Like I never really thought I would see one. Um, and then I found myself on a trip where we're like supposed to find them. So all day, I think we got to like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I just had like this knot in my stomach because like I had really tried to like come up with a strategy and like work with the bridge team to like put us in the right place. And we hadn't found them all day, and I was like, oh my God, we made the wrong choice. Like earlier in the day, we were in green water, like that was a better place to look, but now to backtrack would cost us an hour and a half. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I was so stressed about it. But anyways, it paid off and we ended up seeing them. So that worked out really well. And I think the guests were pleased that we found them again on a second sea ice day. We did also have a really cool sighting that trip of a mom and cub polar bear. It was actually my first polar bears I've ever seen in my life. And it was like the second day of the trip, maybe. And I didn't know that, like, as crew, like we should have even been up at this time to find them, but like a couple of the expedition team had planned to be up on the bridge at like 5:30 in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning, and they were looking for bears with a spotting scope. And I mean I got up early just because I was like excited and wanted to look for stuff. But the assistant expedition leader, I think it was, he spotted the bears from like, well, he spotted a bear from like miles away. And I was like, what the heck? So we get over there with the ship, and then the expedition leader is like, I think this bear is watchable. It's like on the ledge, like it was like a really steep shore break, like maybe a 20-foot like little cliff. And the bear was up on top of the cliff laying in the snow, but he's like, I think we should roll the dice and go in the zodiacs to look at them because we might be able to get closer than we can with the ship and get a better view. Like, let's just try it. Maybe it'll be too far back on the slope and we won't see it, but like, let's just try. So we tried, and as soon as all the zodiacs were in the water with all the guests, well, first of all, this means we woke the guests up early and like took them out before breakfast. So we got them out on deck and we showed them like, here's the bears, enjoy them from the ship. And then, or here's the bear. At the time it was only one. And so everybody was looking at them from the ship, and then the expedition leader was like, okay, we're gonna try and go in the Zodiac, so you guys need to be ready in, I think he told the guests like 20 minutes or something, and he told the guides like, you need to be ready in 5. So we put all the boats down, we got everybody in the boats, and as the last Zodiacs were loading and like starting to go join the group, because we all wait to go together when we're looking at a bear so that nobody gets like a better look than someone else, and nobody like flushes the bears away before all the boats get there. And so almost all the boats are gathered up, and another bear comes walking down to meet up with the first bear. And what it turned out to be was a mom and a cub, and they had a few carcasses on the shoreline, which they were really decomposed, so we couldn't tell what exactly they were. But I took some photos and I was like, well, whatever it is, it looks like it has teeth. So it's some sort of Odonocete, some sort of toothed whale, because of course people are asking like, what are they eating? What are they eating? I'm like, a pile of rotten flesh that has a tail? Like, I don't know. I couldn't really see it that well while we were driving the Zodiacs, and it was like a little bit windy and bouncy and stuff, and it's rolling around in the surf and the bears are ripping on it. I was like, I don't know, like we gotta look on the computer later. So anyway, so we had a bit of a mystery game to play later on the ship, and of course I leaned on my marine mammal identification training about like how to analyze a skeleton, and what things to look for if you just have a stranded skeleton and not a whole fresh carcass, which some of the diehard mammal fans on the boat wanted to argue that it was something else. They thought it was a killer whale, they thought it was all kinds of things, and I was like, my training is telling me it's not any of these things. And then I went and looked for the data about teeth count in Odontocetes, and like that's a big way to tell what species it is, especially if you have something that's like kind of the same size and shape as a few different species. Like their dentition or their teeth is something that's quite different between species, especially the species that they see in the Arctic. Like if you're talking about pilot whales or killer whales or white-beaked dolphins or belugas or narwhals, they all have very different teeth structure to each other. And this had lots of really small teeth, which then told me that they were eating a white-beaked dolphin. Unfortunately, that's the only white-beaked dolphin I saw all season, but yeah, it was, you could see the teeth in some of the photos, and it was definitely a white-beaked dolphin. And the mom and cub looked really good, and the mom was super healthy, lots of weight on her. The cub was really big. My guess is it would get weaned pretty soon. And the cub, when it was eating, was like making little happy bear noises, like those little grunts and growls that you hear occasionally in like nature documentaries and stuff. It was making those noises while it was eating. It was really cute. So that was the first trip of the season. The second trip of the season was also kind of a specialty trip that's not only run like once a season. And it was to the southeast of Svalbard, and it was with a focus on hiking. Hiking in polar bear country is an interesting concept to wrap your brain around, to do these like drop you off in one place, pick you up in another place, because we have to do a lot of scouting before we go to shore. We look from the ship for quite a long time. And then when we get onshore, we do a big scout, and we have people assigned to go to different positions. And then we kind of set up a polar bear perimeter, and people are constantly on watch during a landing. So when you're hiking, you're like having to scout the entire time while you're hiking. So one of the ways we tried to make that easier and like have another set of eyes on the water was to have a Zodiac driver be one of the scouts. So I was the Zodiac driver for one of the hikes, and was scouting for some of the hikes as well with the Zodiac for the hikers. Just kind of like driving ahead of them and like getting my view from the water. I mean, I could only see so far, but at least it was better to like check their direct path ahead of them. And so they were able to get some hikes in. Unfortunately, either the weather or bear sightings or the ground conditions didn't allow them to complete very many hikes, but they did their best to try and do as many hikes as they could. And then after that, for the rest of the season, the trips were circumnavigation routes of all of Svalbard. So going clockwise around all of the islands of Svalbard. And the first one that we tried to do, we couldn't get between two of the islands to do like the classic circumnavigation to go past places like Cap Walberg and a few other places like that have some big bird colonies or historical interests, because it was blocked with ice. So we went the long way around to get to where we needed to go. And when we were offshore, even though we were in shallow water, we did see fin whales, which was a nice sighting, even though it was kind of a big compromise to have to go all the way around. We couldn't get through one of the places we wanted to go to and spend a day or two in. Another trip that we did ended up with some extra time on the southeast side of Svalbard, and we went offshore, and we got out off the continental shelf a little bit out into the like more ocean habitat water, and we got to see fin whales and blue whales, which was also pretty amazing to be able to show people Arctic blue whales. I knew they were around. I knew they were typically easier to see than the Antarctic blue whale, but I just, trying to learn the circumnavigation route and like what our options are for when we could pop out shore and get a look at them. I'm glad it all came together, and the bridge was super accommodating and did a great job watching the whales as they were feeding, and they were really cooperative whales. They're easy to keep track of, and so it was really cool to be able to show people that. Most trips we did see some kind of whale, usually minke whales. We saw walruses on every trip, Arctic foxes almost every trip, and a variety of seals. It sort of depended on where we were. But also we did see quite a few belugas throughout our trips, often very closely associated with the front of a glacier. So these little fjords, when you get in there, you start looking around at the front of the glacier. I mean, you can't drive right up to the front of the glacier in the Zodiac. That's not safe, because if the glacier face drops a bunch of ice, like it could flip your Zodiac over or land on you. It makes a huge wave. But you look real close with your binoculars looking for icebergs that are swimming. And we got pretty lucky in a few places like Monaco Breen and Bergabukta. There was a few spots that were really nice to be able to see belugas. And a couple of times we got really nice close looks at them as well, like able to get photos and videos. They're generally pretty shy. They have been hunted even recently. So they have a pretty strong response to stay away from people. But if you're calm and quiet, then sometimes you luck out and you get a really good look. Some of the circumnavigation trips that we did included a stop in the Seven Islands as we went around to the north. So you start in Longyearbyen on the east side of Svalbard, and then you go north, you go up to the ice edge, you come back south and keep working your way around to the south, and then coming back west to end in Longyearbyen. And the trip's pretty short. They're like 9 days. And so it's a lot to pull off to go to all the highlight spots and have a day in the sea ice, especially because the sea ice is very far north at the middle and end of the season. At the beginning of the season, it's only a few hours from the Seven Islands in the north of the archipelago to get to the ice. But by the July trips, the ice was like 81 degrees north before we were in ice that was too thick for the ship to go through. Like you're a lot closer to the North Pole than you will ever be if you are in sea ice at 81 degrees north. It's a long way up there. And it is alarming for the ice to be that all the way up there. The Seven Islands sometimes is a place where bears get stranded for the summer, waiting for the sea ice to come back. to a reasonable distance that they can either swim to and then navigate, or just connects up to the Seven Islands for the winter season. And it is a place where if there's a carcass of some sort, like a walrus or a whale or something, then bears will just camp out there all summer and stay there because there's food to eat. The Arctic summer is a really lean time for polar bears. They mostly hunt seals on ice, and in the summer the ice is less prevalent. It's a lot harder to walk on because the pieces are more broke up and have holes in them. And the seals have the advantage because they have a lot of options to escape, and the bear can't walk long distances to sneak up on them. So some years, the Seven Islands, if there's a carcass, is a really good place to stop and look for polar bears, because once they find something, they're not going to leave it, because there's not other choices once the ice retreats away from the islands for the summer. But this year, there were no bears every time that we went to the Seven Islands. Of course, you can never, ever, ever assume that there won't be a bear there. Because we did actually find remnants of a den on the backside of one of the islands. But there was no activity that looked recent to support that the mom with the cubs was still there. Probably as soon as they were ready to emerge from the den, she checked if there's any food. There was nothing, and then they went on the ice or they went somewhere else. But you always have to have your guard up. You always have to do a thorough scout, even if you've never seen a bear in that place. And that's the thing with Svalbard. Like, there's so many bears around that you can never let your guard down. Places where you don't think there's ever going to be a bear, one will show up. But one of the highlights in the Seven Islands, even if there's no polar bears, is there's a spot outside of one of the islands where there's like this wash rock that's like kind of big. And there's mom and pup walruses hauled out there. So the moms and the pups tend to be in these isolated areas, not so far from the ice edge. And there's not usually males there, or if there is, there's only like one or two, and they need to be chill because the moms and the pups are not interested in dealing with a bunch of aggressive males. The males tend to make bachelor colonies, not unlike sea lions and other seal species. And so the bachelor colonies are spread out in different places, more closely related to food. But the moms and pups, they need to be around food, but also near the ice edge, because the female, when she does give birth, leaves the colony for a while, gives birth on the sea ice, bonds with the pup, and then comes back to the colony with the pup. And then she keeps the pup with her for several years until the pup is almost all the way full grown. The female pups get to stay in the colony with the moms and other babies for the rest of their life if they want to. Sometimes they do spread out and go to other places, but they usually stay in the colony they're born in. And then the males, once they reach maturity or well, not necessarily like full maturity, but once they're grown up, they're ready to wean, and the mom's ready to get pregnant again, then she kicks the male pup out, and they have to go find a bachelor colony to hang out with the other males. So we got to see little tiny walruses. They don't have tusks when they're born. They grow in as they age. So their like face looks really goofy because they don't have any tusks, and they're like more of a chocolatey brown, and they're laying with their moms or nursing, and it was really cool. We had one day where it was like beautiful sunny glass calm. You could like see the steam coming off their bodies, and you could see their breath, and you could hear them grunting and snorting and all of that. And yeah, it was really cool. I'm glad I got to see that. Even if there wasn't much else going on at the Seven Islands, I'm glad we were able to look at them in the zodiacs. They are fairly curious, but spook easily. I don't think they see very well. Like, there's not really good data to say like how good they do or don't see, but they have all those whiskers on their face. And they're very tactile when they're with each other. They're like always touching each other. And when they're foraging, like they feed on clams, like these massive, massive animals with these big silly tusks eat clams. and they like suction them out of the shell. They don't even like really use their tusks for feeding that much. I mean, they can kind of like dig and crush and stuff if they need to, but like mostly they're like waving the sand with their flipper and then like rooting around with that big mouth, like those huge lips they have, and then just like suctioning the clam out of the shell. So they use the tusks to haul up on ice. Like it's like a lever point. Um, so their scientific name is like horse-faced tooth walker is what it translates to, because they walk with their teeth. They haul up on the ice with their tusks. Um, so males and females have them. The males are bigger, but the males also grow heavier. So you need a bigger, longer, sturdier tusk to be able to pull yourself up onto the ice. And yeah, they don't see super well, and so you have to kind of be careful around them because they do spook easily because of that, because they can't really like exactly tell what's going on. Um, but they can be quite curious, and then like the males on land are like when they're laying in their colony, they're pretty unbothered as long as you approach really quietly. The females with the pups can be a little more skittish, so you have to stay further away, but still, I mean, also they're the cutest. Like I didn't think walruses were that cute until I saw them, and then I was like, wait, these are adorable. Like this is great. Some other highlights of the season in general, besides bowhead whales, walruses, and polar bears, I really liked and enjoyed seeing the Arctic foxes in the different places that we would see them. They're just kind of goofy, like trotting around and sneaking around trying to get food for the summer. Most often, they're associated with a bird colony of some sort to either steal eggs or chicks or tired parents. And so whenever you're at a big bird colony, you always keep an eye out for the fox. In this summer, they lose all their white, long, fluffy hair, and they get this like brown and black coat. And once you see them run up against the rocks in Svalbard, you're like, oh, that is exactly the color you need to be camouflaged for the summertime here. It's pretty incredible. Like when you see a picture of it on like grass or something, you're like, this is kind of funny looking. And then you see them run on like a bunch of broken rocks and you're like, oh, this is exactly how you're supposed to look. We did see one fox on the ice early in the season, which is really rare, but they do cross the ice. There's actually a kid's book called like Anna in the Arctic or something about an Arctic fox that was tagged in Svalbard, and it ran across the sea ice all the way to Alaska. And so they do cover a lot of territory if they need to. When they're on the ice, they're most often following a polar bear and eating the scraps after the bear has killed a seal. But the one we saw, it was trying to run around on the ice and it was chasing birds, but it wasn't successful at catching any when we saw it. We didn't follow it for too long because we didn't want to stress it out, because it's a tough life to be on the sea ice as an Arctic fox. And some of the bird colonies we went to were incredible. I think my favorite place, besides being in the sea ice, is Alcafielet, which is it's a famous bird colony. It's all thick-billed murres, or Brunix guillemot is how they're referred to in Europe. For those of you that are familiar with the North Pacific, we have the common murre. It's related to that. In Alaska, when you get far enough north, you do actually have thick-billed murres as well. It's the same species that has more of a circumpolar distribution. But it's just like these towering columns of like layered rocks that have been weathered over time. And murres are the type of bird that just like, they don't really build a nest. They kind of just like find a flat ledge and like where they can like pin the egg up against the wall and pin the chick up against the wall. And Alcafielet is like this perfect cliff face for thousands, hundreds of thousands of birds to be there. Um, it it's stunning. I mean, whether it's foggy, sunny, whatever, like it is so cool to see that many birds in one place. And there's also like kittiwakes and glaucous gulls, and there was even like barnacle geese and all kinds of activity. There's always foxes there. And so seeing some of these massive bird colonies was incredible. We also had a few places we visited that had small colonies of puffins mixed in with the murres. We got to visit a kittiwake colony as well a few times. And so even though I love whales, like it was really cool to see all these bird colonies and see how they nest. It was really amazing. In the sea ice is where we had the best sightings of seals. But like most Arctic animals, seals were and still are hunted by people. So they're quite leery of ships and anything that looks and smells like humans. Um, I mean, seals are also hunted on the sea ice by polar bears. So anything that seems wrong, boop, they go right in the water. Um, Mostly in the sea ice, we'd see ringed seals and bearded seals. But occasionally we would also see harp seals. Sometimes the harp seals would actually get in like these big groups and swim together, and they're pretty funny and rowdy. They'd like all periscope up and look around and then like slap their heads down on the water and make a big splash. Um, but often they would like get close enough where you'd be like, yeah, I'm gonna get a good photo of this whole group, and then they'd disappear. We did occasionally see walruses in the sea ice as well. It's not super common, but we did see it a few trips where there were walruses on the ice too. Um, we would spend a whole day in the sea ice because we're actually looking for polar bears. About 300 of Svalbard's polar bears live on the islands of Svalbard, and then 700 of them live in the sea ice. That's like Svalbard's area of the sea ice. The population of polar bears in Svalbard is like shared across the border with Russia because it's the Franz Josef Land and Svalbard populations are connected by the sea ice, and it's not there is flow between the bears on land in both places as well. So it's managed as one population. About 1,000 of them are in Svalbard, and then like another 1,500 are in Franz Josef Land and the ice around Franz Josef Land. So Russia and Norway have to work together um, to manage that population of bears. I don't really know how well it goes. I don't know too much about the politics around it, but it definitely has been strained since the Ukraine-Russia conflict has started. And it created a weird political situation on Svalbard as well because there's like a Russian colony there with one of the coal mines. Uh, anyway, but back to the bears. So we go to the sea ice to look for bears on the ice because sometimes they're doing interesting things. You're more likely to see them hunting something if you go on this out to the sea ice because they're hunting seals out there for the summer. Whereas if they're on the island of Svalbard, if they found a carcass, great. If not, they're often like patrolling around looking for bird eggs they can steal from nests, or they're just traveling, or they're just resting. But on the sea ice, you might see them actually hunt something, which can be really interesting. We didn't see that on any of the trips I went on. We had a few bear encounters on the ice. One of them, the bear was asleep in the middle of a huge ice floe, and we couldn't like see it very well for most of the encounter. Um, One of them was a bear. It looked like a female bear. She was like curious about the boat, but like didn't like was also very mobile. She just kept walking. It was hard to kind of keep track of her. We did get a really nice encounter with her for a little while, but then she just kept moving around. And like we were so slow navigating out of the ice when we finally decided to leave her that I could still see her in the spotting scope for like another 2 hours. She was like just walking on a slightly different course than us. And like you could just keep seeing her forever because we were making such slow progress in the ice and she was just like leisurely walking. I mean, I say leisurely, but their stride is huge. It's like several meters long. So like they can close a distance in a really short amount of time because their legs are so long. And they're so good at walking on ice with those huge paws. We did see bears swimming a couple times. One of them was when it was in the ice. We got really nice looks at her swimming between ice floes and then getting up and walking around. One of the times that we saw a bear swimming, I was the safety driver for a kayak group. And oh man, I like there's I don't blame myself for how it all went down. It definitely took us all by surprise. We had a group of like more advanced kayakers, and they were split in half, one with one guide and one with another guide, and some were ahead of me, some were behind me. And I was kind of like trying to keep the middle and manage things and like also keep an eye on the water and what was going on. Um, and I was catching up to the more forward group after watching the group behind me, and they all started yelling polar bear. And at first I thought they were kidding. And then I saw them smacking their paddles on the water to make sure they had my attention. And I was like, oh, no, that's really a polar bear. And I looked at my binoculars and I could see it. And so we scrambled, got the kayaks like detoured a little bit away from the bear, and they all got out of their kayaks and into the Zodiac in less than 6 minutes. And in that 6 minutes, I'd already notified like everybody on the radio that there was a bear, it was in the water, where it was, what we were doing, and they started evacuating the shoreline because we don't want to be on shore when there's a bear because it's too dangerous. Polar bears are way too dangerous, way too strong, way too curious. We don't want to encourage them to be around people at all. So all the guests that were on the landing site were evacuated off by the staff that were there, and the expedition leader was already taking someone back to the ship, so he came and assisted me. And um our best plan to deter the bear while we safely evacuated everyone from shore, that was like the least harmful to the bear and the most reasonable safety wise, was to use his Zodiac to kind of like herd the bear away from the landing site, because the bear wasn't really actually interested in the kayakers. It was the kayakers saw it, but like it was swimming between them and the ship on its way to the landing site. So where we had people on shore. So I think the bear was more interested in the people on shore. And so he used his Zodiac to kind of guide it to the other side of the bay where it did still end up on the beach. And we had a big group of hikers that were like 45 minutes away from the landing site. And so we had to get them down, but you can't rush them because they're on really rough terrain. And so if someone falls, like it becomes an even bigger nightmare to evacuate people when someone's injured and there's a bear. So we got everyone down as quickly as they could, and we launched all the Zodiacs that we had available and drivers for, and we just got everybody off the shoreline. And the bear kept walking to the landing site. And so we had several guides with firearms and flares ready. They loaded their flare guns. And we got the last people off the shoreline just as the bear was kind of like closing into that distance where you need to start firing the flare gun. So we didn't have to use any other deterrents other than the Zodiac, which was really good. But definitely was like a heart racing moment. Like my heart just like dropped into my stomach when they were like, polar bear, polar bear. I was like, are you kidding me right now? But everybody was safe. All our kayakers did so good. Our kayak guides did really well, getting everyone quickly into the Zodiac and away. And yeah, it was definitely a memorable experience. Some other highlights, the only time we were ever on shore with a bear, like intentionally, was at this place called Nye Alisand. So Nye Alisand is a research base for quite a few different scientific groups all around the world. A lot of what they're doing is on climate, but some of it's also on wildlife. And it's a place you can visit on your trip to Svalbard. There's a lot of rules about what you need to do when you're on shore there, but for the sake of the scientists, like having some sort of like normal like town and community and the basis of operations, and not having to deal with all their scientific gear and carry a rifle all the time, there's a polar bear fence and there's full-time polar bear guards. So it's like an electric fence, but then there's also like guard towers where they keep an eye on the surrounding area just to make sure that if there is a bear around, that either the fence is going to work or that there's somebody out there to, one, warn the people, and two, deter the bear. So when we got to Nye Alisand, I think our first visit of the season, there was a bear on an island just outside of the fence. And we were made aware of that, and we showed the people the bear from the boat before we got on shore. And we carried rifles with us on shore, like more than we normally would. Like normally we just have a few people with them to do like a little tour to a historical area that's just outside the fence and back. But this time more staff carried rifles just in case. And then as soon as we like got most of the guests on shore, the bear walked off the island and started swimming. And I saw it swimming, and so I just ended up standing there with like the radio in my hand and like my binoculars up and just like kept track of the bear as it kept swimming. At first I was a little nervous it was going to come to shore where we were, which was like there was no fence. The guards would have stepped in, but like there was the beach they were going to land on. It could have landed on, had no fence. And it instead ended up swimming across the fjord. And I tried to get the bridge to see it because it was swimming past like some visual obstacles that I couldn't see. But another guide was actually in a different place on the base and could see it as well. And it ended up going to an island across the fjord, and going on shore there. So we were fine for our visit, but it was like definitely a little unnerving to like see it and be like, we're on land. It's the only time we would ever do that. Two other encounters I'll just share briefly that stuck out for me. One was another sighting of bowhead whales. So on the third trip of the season, I think that was the same trip we didn't successfully circumnavigate Svalbard. On the sea ice day, I had just stepped inside to do something. I think it was like foggy, and I'd already been on the bridge or outside for a while. And I stepped into the lecture room and I got a call on the radio that there was a whale outside. Somebody thought it was a humpback whale, and I was like, we are so far north and we are in ice. There is no way this is a humpback whale. And I got outside just in time to see the fluke, and it was like really flat. And I was like, oh, that's not a humpback. I didn't get a great look at it, but that's not a humpback. Um, so I was kind of kicking myself that I didn't like push for the ship to turn around because I was like, oh, we just missed a bowhead whale. But at the same time, like we were pushing through pretty thick ice, and like I don't think we would have been able to find it. So the day continues on, and again, I was grabbing something from my room, or I don't know. I wasn't outside. It was like the 5 minutes I wasn't outside. And somebody called out that there was whales off the side of the ship. And before I could even get back outside, the assistant expedition leader, who's also a marine mammal person who had joined for this trip, says these are definitely bowhead whales. And so we got to watch them off the side of the ship, and they were traveling, and it was a group. I couldn't tell if it was two, maybe more. And then we tried to slow down our approach and kind of like ease up on them, and it turned out to be three. And we got a pretty close look off the bow, and one of them like lifted up its chin, and you could see the big white patch on the lower jaw. But then right after that, they all scattered and went in different directions, and they all ran for the ice. And it was quite windy, so it also wasn't like very easy or fun for the ship to try and follow them. We tried to keep up with them a little bit, but by the time they got within like 300 yards of the ice edge, we were like, yeah, they're not into it, and so we should leave. So we got to see three bowhead whales, and it was like a pretty decent sighting. Like I'd say every guest on the ship like actually saw them. We got mediocre pictures, but definitely like proof of species. You could see like the really cool like slope on their triangle slope on their forehead. You could see the white on the jaw of the one, and seeing more than one is always pretty amazing. And then on our way out of the ice, again, another person called on the radio saying there's a humpback whale. And I came up and I was like, there's no way it's a humpback whale. And it took a long time to get honed in on it. It was kind of like weaving around a bunch of open ice. It wasn't going very far between dives, but it's just like it would come up behind the ice and you'd be like, I think something just moved back there.
But it was another bowhead whale, and we stayed with it for like 3 surfacings before we lost it. And that was like the third sighting of the day. So the guests were kind of like, we saw them already. Which I was like, this is so cool. You have no idea. But there were a few people on the bridge, which was nice that they like came and tried to look at them, even though the weather wasn't very nice. So we had 2 different sightings this season of bowhead whales on the ship, which was nice. And then the last like most memorable encounter I had with a polar bear this year was thanks to assistant expedition leader who was on board, Hazel. We were at this place that we don't go to very often, but it has some amazing glacier faces and it's a good place to see ivory gulls, but also just spend a lot of time in really cool ice. And we were, of course, like looking for belugas, looking for whatever. And it was kind of like the second half of the Zodiac cruise. And Hazel just decided to go look at like the bigger glacier and for some reason like decided to go into the corner where the moraine was. Like when she told I was like, "Did you know something that we didn't know?" She's like, "No, I just went in this corner." And I was like, "Why did you go in this corner? It's shallow and muddy and like you're looking at the big pile of gravel." And she's like, "I don't know, I just went over there." but, but there was a mom and a cub polar bear on the beach sleeping. Like just total amazing coincidence. She was like, I almost was like right on top of them before I saw them because they were just laying so still on the beach. And I wasn't expecting them to be there. She's like, I literally just went in this corner because I felt like it. And so it was like kind of like where the moraines of the 2 glacier faces were separating the glaciers. And it's just like this little like pool in the back and like a little hooked beach. And it was a mom and a cub, and it was a cub from that season, so it was really small. Like his paw was as big as his head, and they were super chill, even though it was like a kind of tight packed like corner for all the Zodiacs to go like do a carousel loop to make passes to look at them. Like they got up once for 5 seconds and then laid back down and they were so chill the whole time. Like they would look at us every once in a while, but they were also looking at the birds that were squawking. They were listening for the ice that was moving. Like, and then they slept. And it was the sweetest, cutest encounter to like see these bears just be so chill. The mom did look pretty thin. It's not surprising for that to happen with first season cubs because she's been in the den and she gave birth and nursed in the den. They've been out of the den only really for the summer season, so there's not a lot to eat. She's making milk for this cub. So hopefully this winter they're doing well and they're getting nice and fat, both of them. The next week, another guide said to us that well, he sent Hazel some pictures. He's like, I think this is your same mom and cub, and they looked like they were on an iceberg. And so we were wondering if they just like hitched a ride out of there because we went back to that same place again the next trip and they were not there. So maybe they just took an iceberg taxi out of there and who knows where they ended up.
So that's kind of the recap of the Svalbard season. It was definitely interesting. I'm glad I was able to do it this year. It kind of all came up last minute as because of some other things that had happened. I'd canceled contract and had time available, and there was trips available, and so it worked out. It worked out well. It just wasn't really part of Plan A, but that's okay. Because next year there's a lot of changes coming to Svalbard. The Norwegian government says it's in an effort to mitigate the tourism that's happening on Svalbard and like protect places from wildlife. But the new system doesn't control the number of vessels coming to Svalbard nor the size. So it's good. There's going to be sites that were originally open for landing that are now closed, period, like entirely, or closed to vessels that carry more than 36 people or more than 12 people. Um, but then if you're not controlling the number of boats, then you're putting a lot of pressure on the sites that are open. And then the distances to polar bears is increasing. So no matter if you're on a Zodiac or if you're on the ship, you have to be 500 meters away from bears at all times, which will really change people's viewing experience. And the photos and things that you see people talking about from Svalbard right now are setting like kind of a false set of expectations, because like we used to be able to Zodiac cruise, like we did Zodiac cruise with bears as long as the bears didn't react and you didn't have any negative impact on their behavior. It was okay to look at them in the Zodiacs. It was at the discretion of each operator and the expedition leader. There are really big consequences for harassing a polar bear, but now you have to also be 500 meters away. And the amount of guests I see come on with just their cell phone, no binoculars, like it's going to be really hard for them to have like a takeaway from the trip that's their own. But also even just like viewing experience, like if you need to look at a bear through binoculars to really like see that it's a bear, I feel like people are just not going to get out of it what they're hoping for. And like some of that's going to be on us on the ships to try and manage expectations and prepare people properly for the trip. But also, like, that's the rules now. Like, it it's not really facilitating the tourism that you used to be able to do on Svalbard. And I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's wrong. But I think people that visit Svalbard in the future are going to come away with it like kind of disappointed, because what they've seen people be able to do in all of the time that tourism's been open there, you can't do anymore. And so I don't really know how different companies are going to adjust to it. One, because booking sites is going to be a lot harder if there's no limit on the number of ships there. But two, the polar bear viewing is going to change significantly. And so I don't, we'll see how operators figure out how to deal with it. But it's going to be very different next year compared to this year. So hopefully you enjoyed my little recap of my summer in the Arctic, and it was informative and interesting. Again, I appreciate you all so much for listening to our episodes and for supporting the podcast. And we'll see you on the next one. Thank you. Bye.